The first time I saw a human, I thought they were broken. My name is, and I belong to the Collective, a proud warrior race that has conquered 17 star systems across the Andromeda spiral. We are tall, standing nearly 3 meters in height, with chitinous exoskeletons that can deflect plasma fire and 4 arms that allow us to wield multiple weapons simultaneously. Our mandibles can crush through reinforced steel, and our compound eyes can track dozens of targets at once. For over 2,000 cycles, we have been the apex predators of known space. So when the small, pink, soft-skinned creature shuffled into our War Council chamber on the Fortress world of N, I assumed it was some kind of servant or perhaps a meal for our allies. "Greetings," the thing said in a surprisingly clear voice through its translation device. "I am Commander Sarah of the Human Colonial Defense Force. We've come to discuss an alliance." The War Council erupted in what I can only describe as bemused chittering. General, our supreme commander, lowered his massive head to get a better look at the tiny being. "You wish to fight alongside the Collective? Little creature, you barely reach my ankle joint. What could your species possibly offer in our war against the Empire?" The human, this Sarah, did something completely unexpected. She smiled. Not the fear grimace we'd seen from other species when confronted with our might, but something else entirely. Something that made the temperature in the room feel suddenly colder. "We offer experience," she said simply. "We've been fighting wars since before we could travel between stars. We've fought each other, our environment, predators that outweighed us by tons, diseases that should have wiped us out, and we've never stopped. We fight when we're outnumbered and out of options. Most importantly, we fight when everyone else thinks we should surrender." I found myself leaning forward despite my initial dismissal. There was something in her tone, something that my warrior instincts recognized even though my logic rejected it. "They have pushed your forces back across 6 systems in the past year," continued, pulling up a holographic display. "Their bioships adapt to your weapons, their swarm tactics overwhelm your traditional battle formations, and their psychic attacks break the will of your warriors. You're losing this war because you're fighting it like soldiers. We fight like survivors." General's mandibles clicked in annoyance. "And what makes you think your survivor tactics will succeed where our military might has failed?" Smile widened slightly. "Because we've already been fighting them, for 3 years actually. They hit our colonies first, thinking we'd be an easy meal before moving on to bigger threats. They were wrong." She activated another section of the hologram, showing battle footage that made my primary stomach clench. Humans, these small, fragile creatures, were fighting bioships in ways I'd never imagined. They weren't standing in formation exchanging fire. They were crawling through ventilation systems, setting off explosions from inside enemy vessels, using their own ships as projectile weapons, and engaging in combat so chaotic and unpredictable that even watching it made my tactical processors ache. "The think in terms of biological imperatives," explained as we watched a human soldier detonate what appeared to be a nuclear device while still inside a vessel. "Feed, reproduce, expand, survive. They can't understand a species that will choose death over defeat, that will sacrifice everything for a tactical advantage, or that will turn their own weakness into a weapon." One of the videos showed a human ship, clearly disabled and drifting, suddenly coming alive and ramming into a dreadnought at full speed. The explosion consumed both vessels, but it also created an opening that allowed a dozen other human ships to penetrate the formation. "You're describing suicidal behavior," observed Commander, our strategic analyst. "No rational species would." "Rationality is overrated," interrupted. "They are rational. They calculate odds, assess threats, make logical decisions, but logic has limits. When humans decide something needs to die, logic doesn't enter the equation. We find a way." She showed us more footage. Humans fighting inside bioships with improvised weapons. Human soldiers continuing to fight even after sustaining injuries that should have incapacitated them. Entire human crews staying behind on doomed vessels to ensure their final shots counted. But what disturbed me most was how they reacted to humans. These creatures that had carved through our defenses like they were nothing, these swarm fighters that had adapted to every tactic we'd tried against them, were fleeing from human contact. In several videos, bioships that vastly human vessels were retreating rather than engaging. "Why do they run?" I found myself asking. Turned those strange, binocular eyes toward me. Up close, I could see that they weren't the simple organs I'd assumed. There was an intelligence there, but also something else, something predatory. Because they've learned to recognize the pattern, she said. Every time they fight humans, even when they win, they lose something. Ships, tactics, advantages they thought were permanent. We don't just fight to win battles. We fight to learn how to win the next battle. And the battle after that, every defeat teaches us something new about our enemy. She brought up a tactical display showing human fleet movements over the past 3 years. What I saw everything I understood about military strategy. Human forces were actively seeking out combat with superior forces, engaging in battles they couldn't win, and then retreating before total annihilation. But each retreat was organized, purposeful, designed to gather intelligence and test responses. "You're using your own soldiers as expendable test subjects," General observed, his tone carrying a mix of horror and respect. "We volunteer for it," corrected. "Every human in our military knows the deal. We might die learning how to kill our enemies, but what we learn will help our species survive. It's not expendable if it serves the greater purpose." She showed us the results. Human weapons that had been modified based on captured technology. Human ships designed specifically to counter bioship advantages. Most impressively, human psychological warfare tactics that were causing measurable changes in behavior patterns. "They're starting to hesitate," explained. "For a species that thinks in terms of biological drives, hesitation is death. They're becoming afraid of what we might do next, and that fear is making them less effective against everyone else too." I realized then that I was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that had weaponized its own mortality, that had turned the survival instinct inside out and made it into an offensive capability. "What do you want from the collective?" General asked finally. "Simple, we want you to let us teach you how to really fight. Not soldier against soldier, not fleet against fleet, but species against species. They see you as competing predators. They see us as something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist but does anyway. We want to make them see everyone that way." Brought up one final display, showing human and ships operating together in coordinated strikes against positions. But it wasn't traditional coordination. The humans were using strength and firepower as platforms for their own devastating tactics, while we're learning to fight with human adaptability and ruthlessness. "They adapt to known threats," she concluded. "But they can't adapt to something that's constantly changing, constantly learning, constantly willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to hurt them back. That's what humans bring to this war, not just our tactics, but our mindset." The War Council was silent for a long moment. I could feel my fellow warriors processing what we'd seen, trying to understand how this soft, small species had managed to do what our mighty fleets could not. Finally, General spoke. "If we agree to this alliance, what guarantees do we have that humans won't turn these same tactics against us when the war is over?" Smile returned, and this time I recognized it for what it was. The expression of a predator that had just found particularly interesting prey. "You don't," she said simply. "That's part of what makes us effective. We're not your allies because we love you. We're your allies because we hate them more than we distrust you. For now." It was the most honest thing any potential ally had ever said to the collective. And somehow, that honesty was more reassuring than any promise would have been. The alliance was agreed to within the hour. I volunteered to serve as liaison between human and forces, thinking it would be an easy assignment working with these peculiar but interesting creatures. I had no idea what I was volunteering for. I had no concept of what real fear felt like, or how thoroughly humans would teach me to understand it. They weren't the only species about to discover just how dangerous humans could be. As I prepared for my first joint mission, watching human soldiers prepare their equipment with the same casual efficiency my people used to clean their mandibles, I thought I understood what we were getting into. I was wrong about everything. The first joint operation was scheduled for the Helix Nebula system, where a biofleet had established what appeared to be a breeding facility on the fourth planet. Intelligence suggested they were developing new warrior organisms there, possibly ones specifically designed to counter defensive capabilities. I expected a traditional assault. Doctrine called for a massed fleet approach, overwhelming firepower concentrated on primary targets, followed by systematic destruction of secondary objectives. Clean, efficient, decisive. What I got instead was my first real lesson in human warfare. "We're not going to attack the facility," Commander announced during the briefing aboard the human vessel Indomitable. I was the only non-human present, towering over the gathered humans like a giant among children. We're going to make them think we're attacking the facility. The human tactical display showed something that made my combat instincts recoil in confusion. Instead of assault vectors and target priorities, it showed what could only be described as elaborate theater. Decoy ships, false sensor readings, coordinated misinformation campaigns designed to convince that a massive assault was imminent. While they're preparing for an attack that isn't coming, continued Lieutenant's tactical officer, we'll be infiltrating their actual command structure 3 systems away. The breeding facility is bait. It's meant to draw us into a trap where they can study our combined fighting capabilities. I felt my mandibles click involuntarily. How could you possibly know their intentions? A human named Jackson, who appeared to be some kind of intelligence specialist, grinned in that unsettling way humans did when they were pleased with themselves. Because it's what we would do. When you're facing an enemy you don't understand, you create situations that force them to reveal their capabilities. They are smart, but they think like predators. We think like prey that learned how to hunt back. The next several hours were a revelation in applied paranoia. The humans had analyzed not just battle tactics, but psychology, biology, communication patterns, even what they called behavioral drift patterns that indicated how decision-making changed under stress. Their pack hunters elevated to a galactic scale, explained Doctor, a human who spoke about with the casual tone of someone discussing an interesting but ultimately manageable pest problem. They operate on principles of resource acquisition, threat assessment, and adaptive evolution. But they're still fundamentally biological entities, which means they have biological limitations. She brought up a display showing neural activity patterns. They can't truly comprehend intentional self-destruction as a tactical choice. Their survival instincts are too hardwired. When faced with illogical behavior, they default to assuming they've misunderstood the situation rather than accepting that their opponents might genuinely not care about survival. I watched as the humans outlined their actual plan. While ships created the illusion of an impending assault on the breeding facility, human infiltration teams would penetrate command vessels in the nearby system and plant what they called cognitive viruses, information designed to propagate through communication networks and create systematic decision-making errors. "You're going to board ships deliberately," I said, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "Their bioships are filled with acid atmospheres, organic weapons that respond to thought, and warrior drones that can regenerate from nearly any injury." "Yep," said cheerfully, "should be fun." The human confidence was either inspiring or terrifying. I hadn't decided which. The operation began 18 hours later. I was assigned to observe from the flagship Rathavan, watching as our ships moved into what appeared to be standard assault formation around the breeding facility. To any observer, including it looked like a textbook fleet action. What they couldn't see were the humans. Small human ships, barely larger than escape pods, had been launched days earlier and were drifting through space on ballistic trajectories that would intersect with positions. They were powered down, cold, invisible to most sensors, and each one contained a team of humans in what they called hostile environment suits. I monitored the communications as the human teams approached their targets. What I heard changed my understanding of courage forever. "Team 7, we have visual on target bioship. Looks like a heavy cruiser variant, approximately 2 kilometers long. Lots of defensive organelles, maybe 60% coverage." "Copy Team 7. Remember, we're not here to destroy anything. Get in, plant the packages, get out if possible." "Roger, if not possible, then make sure the packages activate." There was no hesitation in the human voices. No fear. They were discussing the probability of their own deaths with the same tone my people used to discuss weather conditions. I watched through long-range sensors as the human teams made contact with vessels. What followed every principle of space warfare I'd ever learned. The humans didn't attempt to fight their way aboard the enemy ships. Instead, they used the bioship's own defensive systems against them. When organic weapons attempted to destroy the approaching human pods, the humans deliberately triggered partial destruction that sent debris, including themselves, into the bioship's intake systems. "Team 3 is inside target vessel. Looks like we came in through some kind of nutrient processing organ. The walls are trying to digest our suits." "How's your integrity?" down to about 6 hours of protection, more than enough time. I watched readouts showing human life signs disappearing as teams penetrated deeper into vessels. These creatures were dying, and they were transmitting tactical information right up until their signals cut out. Team 5 has located what appears to be a neural processing center, planting cognitive virus package now. Be advised, we're getting some kind of psychic pressure. Johnson is bleeding from his ears. Can you complete the mission? Package is active. Virus is propagating. Johnson says the voices in his head are really annoying, but he can deal with it. More teams reported in. Some successfully completed their missions and managed to extract. Others went silent after confirming that their objectives had been achieved. The humans treated both outcomes with equal acceptance. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the casual acceptance of death. It was what the humans were actually doing inside the ships. Team 1, we've accessed the bioship's memory core. You need to see this. They're not just breeding warriors here. They're breeding them specifically to counter psychological warfare tactics. Explain. They've been studying human behavior patterns from our previous engagements. They're developing warrior organisms that don't experience fear, doubt, or hesitation. Basically, they're trying to create that think like humans. There was a pause in the transmission. When S's voice returned, it carried a tone I'd never heard from her before, something that might have been amusement but felt much more dangerous. How far along are they in the development process? Early stages, maybe 6 months from deployment, but there's something else. They're terrified of us. The bioship's memory core has extensive data on human tactics, but all of it is categorized under what translates to incomprehensible threat responses. They literally cannot understand how we fight. Good, plant the virus and add a special package. What kind of special package? The kind that teaches them why being afraid of humans is the thing they've ever done. I never learned the specifics of what the humans planted in the systems that day. But 3 hours after the teams had completed their infiltrations, something unprecedented happened. The fleet around the breeding facility began attacking itself. It started small, individual bioships turning on their neighbors, apparently convinced that they had been infiltrated by human agents. But the cognitive virus the humans had planted was designed to spread through communication networks, carrying information that exploited specific flaws in their collective decision-making process. Within 6 hours, the entire presence in the system was engaged in a civil war. Bioships that had operated in perfect coordination for years were now treating each other as threats. The breeding facility was destroyed not by human weapons, but by ships that had become convinced it was compromised. How, I asked as we watched the fleet tear itself apart. How did you know their psychology well enough to engineer this? His expression was thoughtful as she watched the destruction below. Because we've done it to ourselves. Humans have been using psychological warfare against other humans for thousands of years. We know how to create paranoia, how to exploit trust, how to turn strength into weakness. They are just another species that thinks they're smarter than they actually are. She turned to me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my exoskeleton feel suddenly fragile. The scary thing isn't that we can do this to the scary thing is that we developed these capabilities for use against each other. Everything you've seen today, every tactic we've used, we learned by fighting our own species. The realization hit me like a plasma bolt to the thorax. Humans hadn't developed their warfare capabilities against alien threats. They had developed them against themselves. Every horrifying, incomprehensible, effective tactic they used was refined through of humans fighting humans. Your species has been at war with itself for your entire history, I said slowly. Pretty much, confirmed. And we're good at it. Very, very good at it. They are dangerous, but they're predictable. They follow biological imperatives, logical patterns, comprehensible motivations. Humans, we fight each other over ideas, beliefs, resources that don't even exist yet, and sometimes just because we're bored. We've learned to fight enemies who know everything about us, who share our psychology, our biology, our history. Fighting aliens is actually easier. I watched the last bioship in the system go dark, its hull breached by weapons fire from its former allies. The humans had won a decisive victory without firing a shot, without losing a single ship, by simply making the enemy afraid of shadows. What happens next? I asked. Smiled that predatory smile I was learning to dread. Next, we teach you how to think like humans, because they aren't going to fall for the same trick twice, and when they come back, they're going to be very, very angry. That's when the real fight begins. As we prepared to leave the system, I found myself wondering if the collective had made a terrible mistake. We had thought we were gaining allies, but allies implied equality, mutual benefit, shared risk. What we had actually done was invite predators into our den. Predators who were smart enough to know exactly how dangerous they were, and confident enough to not care whether we realized it or not. They weren't the only species that was about to learn what real fear felt like. I was beginning to understand that the humans had been teaching that lesson to everyone they met, enemy and ally alike. And our education was just beginning. 6 months after the Helix Nebula operation, I thought I understood humans. I was confident in my assessment of their capabilities, comfortable with their tactical innovations, and beginning to appreciate their psychological warfare techniques. I had even started adopting some of their strategic thinking patterns. I was a fool. The response to their defeat was swift and overwhelming. They returned to collective space with a fleet that comprehension. Bioships the size of moons, warrior organisms that had been specifically designed to counter every human tactic we had observed, and most terrifyingly, new command entities that seemed immune to psychological manipulation. They call them the Purged, Doctor explained during the emergency briefing. Her usual casual demeanor had been replaced by something I had never seen in a human before, genuine concern. They have surgically removed the fear response from these creatures. No capacity for doubt, hesitation, or self-preservation instincts that could be exploited. They're perfect biological weapons. The tactical displays showed the advancing fleet, and for the first time since meeting humans, I felt my species' ancient instinct for retreat beginning to surface. The enemy force was massive, coordinated, and apparently immune to the tactics that had given us victory before. They've also adapted their bioships, continued Lieutenant. Redundant systems, isolated communication networks, psychological shielding. Everything they learned from our previous encounters has been incorporated into new designs. General's mandibles clicked in frustration. They're using our own victories against us. Every time we adapt, they adapt faster. I expected to present another brilliant tactical solution, another piece of human psychological warfare that would turn our enemies' strengths against them. Instead, she did something that chilled my chitin more than any threat. She laughed. Not the confident expression I had grown accustomed to, but something deeper, something that spoke of experiences I didn't want to understand. Perfect, she said, still chuckling. They've done exactly what I hoped they would do. They've become so afraid of human unpredictability that they've tried to engineer it out of themselves. They've made themselves perfect soldiers. How is that good for us? I asked, my voice carrying more worry than I intended. His expression shifted, and I saw something in her eyes that made me wish I had never asked the question. Because perfect soldiers are predictable, and humans specialize in killing things that are predictable. The next several hours were an inhuman military philosophy that I pray to my ancestors I never have to witness again. They think they've solved the human problem, explained to the assembled fleet commanders. They've created warriors without fear, without doubt, without the capacity for irrational behavior. They think this makes them immune to our tactics. She brought up a display showing human fleet formations, but they looked wrong somehow. Chaotic. Ships positioned in patterns that violated basic principles of mutual support and coordinated fire. What they don't understand is that human tactics aren't based on psychology. They're based on physics and mathematics, and the fundamental principle that anything can be destroyed if you're willing to pay the price. Jackson, the intelligence specialist, took over the briefing. We've been studying biology for 3 years now. Not their behavior, not their psychology, but their actual physical limitations. Turns out that when you remove fear from a biological system, you also remove a lot of safety mechanisms. The display changed to show detailed scans of bioships. Fear exists for a reason, Jackson continued. It keeps organisms from doing things that will kill them. When you remove that limitation, you create entities that will pursue objectives regardless of the cost to themselves. That's supposed to be an advantage, General observed. Against most enemies, yes, agreed. But humans aren't most enemies. We've learned to turn suicidal determination into a weapon system. What followed was the most horrifying tactical briefing I had ever attended. The humans had developed what they called sacrifice multipliers, scenarios where human losses would trigger exponentially greater enemy losses. They had analyzed bioship vulnerabilities and identified ways to cause catastrophic system failures that would propagate through entire fleets. The key is getting them to commit fully to engagements they think they can win, explained. Without fear to make them cautious, they'll pursue advantage until they're overextended. That's when we trigger the real weapons. What real weapons? I asked. Pulled up another display, and I felt my warrior instincts scream in terror. It showed human ships that had been modified in ways that violated every principle of engineering safety I knew. Reactors with disabled containment systems, weapon arrays that would destroy their host vessels upon firing, life support systems that could be converted into area effect weapons. We're going to show them what humans do when we stop pretending to be civilized, said quietly. Every ship in our fleet has been modified to function as a weapon of mass destruction, not just against the enemy, but against anything in the surrounding space. I realized then that I was looking at a fleet designed to commit suicide. Every human vessel was a potential Nova bomb. Every human crew was a guided missile with the intelligence to choose its own target. This is madness, I whispered. No, corrected. This is necessity. They have made themselves into perfect weapons, but perfect weapons have perfect weaknesses. They can't understand opponents who are willing to lose everything for the chance to hurt them. The battle began 3 days later in the system. The fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their new bioships moving with mechanical precision. They had indeed overcome their fear, replaced it with cold, calculating efficiency. It was beautiful to watch, and it was exactly what the humans had been counting on. All human vessels, this is Commander, came the transmission across all frequencies. You know what we're here to do, you know what it costs, make it count. What happened next, everything I thought I knew about space warfare. The human fleet didn't engage in traditional combat. Instead, they scattered into seemingly random patterns, with individual ships or small groups approaching different sections of the enemy formation. To any observer, it looked like panic, confusion, the breakdown of command and control. But I was monitoring human communications, and what I heard was the most terrifying conversation in the history of galactic conflict. Suicide Run 7, approaching target bioship cluster. We can take out their command vessel if we detonate close enough. Confirmed, Suicide 7. You are cleared for proximity detonation. Copy that. It's been an honor serving with you all. I watched as a human destroyer accelerated directly toward a cluster of command vessels. The bioships opened fire, their organic weapons tearing through the human ship's hull, but the vessel continued on course. When it finally exploded, the detonation was contained within a specially modified reactor core that created a controlled gravitational collapse. The explosion consumed not just the human ship, but 3 bioships and severely damaged 2 others. This scene repeated across the battlefield. Individual human vessels sacrificing themselves to create tactical advantages, but doing so with surgical precision. Each death was calculated, measured, designed to achieve maximum strategic impact. But the true horror wasn't the willing sacrifice of human crews. It was how they reacted to it. They're not pulling back, I observed, watching the enemy fleet continue to advance despite mounting losses. Of course not, replied from her command vessel. They can't feel fear anymore, remember? They see human ships destroying themselves and they interpret it as desperation, evidence that they're winning. They don't understand that this is how humans fight when we're serious. They pressed their attack, their fearless warriors pursuing what appeared to be a fleeing and disorganized human force. They couldn't comprehend that they were being led into a carefully prepared killing field. Phase 2, all remaining vessels, announced. The scattered human ships suddenly began moving in perfect coordination, converging on predetermined points within the formation. But they weren't attacking. They were positioning themselves. This voice came through my personal communicator. You might want to close your eyes for this part. Before I could ask why, the human ships began to change. Hull plating retracted to reveal weapon systems I had never seen before. Energy signatures spiked beyond anything that should have been possible for vessels of their size. All ships' final authorization code acknowledged. Project Damocles is live. I learned later that Project Damocles was the human solution to fighting enemies without fear. If psychological warfare wouldn't work, they would create physical weapons so devastating that psychology became irrelevant. The human ships exploded, all of them simultaneously in a coordinated detonation that had been planned down to the microsecond. But these weren't simple reactor explosions. They were controlled antimatter releases, each one calibrated to create intersecting fields of destruction that would amplify each other. The result was the complete annihilation of both fleets. In the space of 30 seconds, the entire invasion force ceased to exist, along with every human vessel in the system. I sat in stunned silence aboard the flagship, trying to process what I had witnessed. The humans had won by losing everything. They had achieved total victory by accepting total defeat. "Commander," I called into my communicator. There was no response. There couldn't be. Was dead, along with every other human who had participated in the battle. But then, impossibly, her voice came through the communication system. "Hello, if you're hearing this, it means the operation was successful." It was a recording, of course. A message she had prepared before the battle, knowing she wouldn't survive to deliver it personally. "By now you're probably wondering if humans are insane," her voice continued. "The answer is yes, but not in the way you think. We're not crazy because we don't fear death. We're crazy because we've learned to make death into a weapon." I felt something I had never experienced before. A deep, existential terror that had nothing to do with physical danger, and everything to do with the realization that I was sharing the galaxy with a species that could casually orchestrate its own extinction for tactical advantage. The thought they could beat us by removing fear from their soldiers, its recording continued. "But fear isn't our weakness, it's our gift to our enemies. We teach them to be afraid because we've learned that fear is the only rational response to dealing with humans." More fleets would come, this message explained. They would be even more advanced, even better adapted to counter human tactics. But they would also be carrying the knowledge that humans had willingly destroyed an entire fleet, including themselves, to achieve victory. "They'll spend the rest of this war wondering what else we're willing to sacrifice," her voice said. "What other weapons we've prepared, what other prices we're willing to pay. And that uncertainty, that fear of what humans might do next, will make them less effective against everyone else." The recording ended with a final message. "The real weapon isn't our ships or our tactics. It's the knowledge that when humans decide something needs to die, we'll find a way to kill it, even if it kills us too. That's what makes us effective allies, and that's what should terrify our enemies." In the days that followed, as collective forces mopped up scattered remnants throughout the sector, I began to understand what had really been teaching me. Fear wasn't just an emotion. It was a tool, a weapon, a form of communication between species. Humans had learned to broadcast a very specific message to their enemies. "We are willing to do things you cannot imagine, pay prices you would never consider, and sacrifice everything for the chance to hurt you. Your best strategy is to avoid us entirely." Despite their technological superiority, had received that message. Within a year, they had withdrawn from collective space entirely, choosing to seek easier prey elsewhere in the galaxy. The alliance between humans and the collective continued, but it was forever changed. We had gained the most effective military partners in known space, but we had also learned what it meant to stand next to a species that viewed their own extinction as an acceptable tactical option. I still serve as a liaison between our peoples. I help coordinate joint operations, share intelligence, and maintain the diplomatic relationships that keep our alliance strong. But every day, I carry the knowledge of what I witnessed in the system. Every day, I remember that when humans decide something needs to die, they'll find a way to kill it, regardless of the cost to themselves. And every day, I'm grateful that humanity has chosen to be our ally rather than our enemy. Because I've learned what real fear feels like, and it's the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, there's a species so committed to survival that they've mastered death itself as a weapon. The humans taught that to fear them, but in doing so, they taught the entire galaxy the same lesson. Some things are more dangerous than death, and humans are all of them.